Olin Johnston joins us from the University of Maine at Augusta. Olin is the coordinator of the Citizen Corps here in Maine. He has 20 years experience as an EMT paramedic and as a police officer and as a volunteer firefighter. He joined in 1997 the first Train the Trainer team from Maine dealing with emergency response to terrorism. He became a WMD awareness level instructor in the fall of 2001, and he continues to teach both ERT and WMD response. He has a background in EMS administration, planning and management, has allowed him to develop a pilot project in Western Maine involving both AmeriCorps and the Medical Reserve Corps. And it certainly does prepare him well for his current role as coordinator for Citizen Corps. So this is a very important component of today's presentation. Olin, we welcome you to our session.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you fine, sir.
Great. I invite everybody to interrupt me as I go through this. There's quite a bit to it, and I've tried to streamline it. If you have any questions on any of the components, just please speak up. I'm going to start off by giving just a brief overview of how the Maine Citizen Corps came to be. We started with some stages of planning and strategizing back in 2002, with an actual implementation of a state coordinating council in 2003. That would be in the spring of 2003. The original mission, which does stand today, is very broad, but I'll explain the reasons for that. Our purpose is to create a volunteer infrastructure that leverages existing programs and agencies to engage citizens in addressing local community needs. Now, with that being said, it's evolved into much more than that. A little more history. My office is actually located on the University of Southern Maine system in the Muskie School for Public Service. The Muskie School contracts with Maine Emergency Management Agency and the Maine Commission for Community Service. They are the funders of the Maine State Citizen Corps from the federal government. We have a state council that is actually co-chaired by Art Cleaves, the Director of Maine Emergency Management, and also a commissioner from the Maine Commission for Community Service sits in the directorship of that. What we decided to do, and it's been very successful, is bring basically every possible discipline to the table on this state coordinating council. Through the forethought of the State Planning Office and Maine Emergency Management, we brought everybody from nonprofits to all of the broad spectrum of volunteer programs in the state of Maine, private sector representation, federal partners, NOAA, the Corporation for National Community Service, the Red Cross and all their affiliates and partners. We have representation from educational and school systems, all facets of healthcare, and of course police, fire, EMS have state level representation on our board also. EMA, clearly, with Art sitting in one of the co-chairs, and private sector hazmat, which, as we know, the majority of our hazmat coverage does come from private sector industry here in Maine, through the mills and what have you. It was interesting bringing these folks together, first of all. These are folks that typically haven't sat at the same table, much less worked on any level of collaboration other than the occasional need that they had seen. So we were pushing for this benefit of kind of a cross-pollination effect for the strategic planning and trying to build some synergistic relationships with what we were trying to accomplish. Again, historically, there hasn't been a whole lot of effective communications, much less collaboration between a lot of these people that we've been able to bring to the table. Our system by design allows for county-level councils to be enacted. Now, we did this because of the federal stipulations on the Citizen Corps money, that things get passed down to a unit of government, and the county government was identified at the EMA office, specifically what we chose to use. Currently, 16 counties, you have 16 EMA offices, and that may change in the future, how we approach that, but for now it's been very effective. little more background on Citizen Corps itself. From the federal level on down, it allows for a very much a personalization to occur to achieve the most benefit at the lowest grassroots level that it affects. This latitude is built into each discipline, whether it be the Medical Reserve Corps programs, which is joint funded through the Department of Health and Human Services from the federal level, as well as through the now currently the Office of Domestic Preparedness under the Citizen Corps umbrella. Volunteers and police service programs, the Neighborhood Watch programs, community emergency response teams, and as of 7 or 8 days ago, the newly announced Fire Corps, which is one of the core components now to the Federal Citizen Corps programs. And that is all the information I have on Fire Corps. More to follow on that. What we've done is we have chosen to take an all-hazards approach to the planning and implementation of the programs. It's been interesting to try and get people to focus on the all-hazards approach, because there's so much out there about the terrorism and the needs for mitigation, response, recovery, and preparedness surrounding terrorism, that all-hazards language has kind of taken a back seat to that. What we've been promoting is the fact that, especially here in Maine, given the nature of the weather that we can have, given the nature of our being contiguous, a large border, large basically open border with another country, and the coastline, we still promote the all-hazards approach in all the planning and all the programs, even down to the local level. People are very receptive to this. We just need to keep reminding ourselves that there's more to this broad-based planning and preparation than to just the terrorism, even though right now, currently, that's on the forefront. We've had very good luck collaborating at the federal level. To give you an example, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration out of Washington is a partner that is represented on our state council. What they have done is entered into a process with us to place the new updated weather radios specifically in each school, public and private, in the state of Maine. These, of course, have the new alert systems built into them that you can program for either a regional, state, county-wide type of alerting system. That just gives you an example of one of the successes that we've had by partnering with some folks at the federal level. Pretty much the big players in our world at state level is the Maine Commission for Community Service, Maine Emergency Management Agency, and the Department of Public Safety, being the emergency medical services representation. They are the core components. I work with those folks daily, even more so with some increasing issues with the Homeland Security, specifically here in Maine. We work very closely. We have an outreach program that's been very effective with the county EMA offices. As we all know, they are very overloaded in what they've been asked to do over the last couple of years, and getting more so every day. This is what we're doing, is helping them build their capacity. We've promoted the VISTA AmeriCorps program, which gets them some help in their offices. We're doing an outreach to educate them on what Citizen Corps can offer, and trying to engage local citizens in their counties, in their localities, to help take some of the burden off. And it's been very successful. At the local level, one of the things that we're doing is promoting volunteerism based on community needs assessments. Now, these take all kinds of different looks at the local level, but pretty much once you speak with people and decide and show them what you're talking about on community needs assessments, they find innumerable amounts of things that are needs identified in their areas, and therefore that's where Citizen Corps comes in, and they can shape and mold and personalize any number of these programs to fit what their needs are. Our evolving mission clearly is more so programmed to the Homeland Security base at this point, and getting more so every day. Again, we still try and keep the all hazards approach, but the way the funding is coming out of Washington, the verbiage is coming down in the grants that we've been getting, the requests for grants and things. It's becoming very clear that the government wants to see a collaborative approach. They want to see interoperability between at all levels. They want to see entities working together, and they want to see you be able to clearly define that on paper for a continuation of grants and things like this. Clearly, they are very strongly heading down that road. One of the more interesting projects that we're doing right now is that we've been sanctioned by Maine Emergency Management to develop what's called a Maine Strike Team. I have to apologize to Peter for using the phrase DMAT, which he put in the publication for this. We're hopefully going to evolve into DMAT at some point, but for now we're going to have what's called a Maine Medical Strike Team, and this is following under the umbrella of the Metropolitan Medical Response System. We are partnering with New Hampshire and Vermont into a larger program called the MMRS. Now, what that amounts to is a specifically trained group of doctors, nurses, EMTs, paramedics, and support personnel who are a rapid in-state response to a surge capacity issue at a hospital, to a force protection type of issue with a response to some sort of hazard, to integration with a strategic national stockpile deployment, which is an issue that's currently being addressed in Maine. What Maine is going to do over the next few weeks is develop a small core group of these responders under the auspices of Maine Emergency Management, and we are going to have them deployable hopefully very shortly. Now, they're going to provide medical force protection by definition, as well as some deployment purposes with a strategic national stockpile. This is interesting because most of your rural areas in America do not have access to an MMRS or a DMAT, which is just a more federalized version of what this is. Same people are involved typically. It's just DMAT has some semantics behind it because of how the federal government funds those types of programs. So this is an actual demonstration project being headquartered out of Dartmouth-Hitchcock to put this all together. So a lot of the rural areas across the U.S. are definitely watching this to see how we formulate this and program it. So that's a very very interesting and exciting component to what we're doing right now. Typically, the federal response, especially in Maine, the anticipated response is 24 to 72 hours for some real tangible response should something happen where they get called. This Maine strike team will be deployable within 4 to 6 hours. That's one of the goals that we are shooting for. Anybody have any questions on that so far? It's kind of a rapid overview.
I think it's pretty clear.
Regarding the interoperability, as we design this Maine strike team, we're going to be pulling in the technical and logistical programming specialists to do this right, even though we're going to start with a very small core of 12 to 15 people to begin with. One of our tactical objectives is to have redundant systems in place, including redundant communication systems, and we need to develop a cross-platform of communications between the private sector, the state, county, and local government level agencies, as well as the military. There's a few platforms that are out there that can do that, but as you all know, they tend to be rare. There isn't a whole lot of crossing over even now. Well, we want to expand that and work with that. So we're going to be getting hold of the proper people to help us build this into the system. We will have at our disposal a significant amount of federal resources to the DRMO offices and things of this nature to hopefully basically build our capacity for now, build our capacity to respond without having to rely on a lot of other startup sources like immediate funding sources, which take time to do. One of the interesting things as far as funding that's happened for Citizen Corps over the last couple of years, originally this was housed under FEMA, and of course all the changes in the Department of Homeland Security, is currently housed under the Office of Domestic Preparedness. Now clearly there's some restructuring and internal reorganizing going on at the federal level right now, which is fine because they seem to be attempting to streamline the funding, which has been one of the complaints that the senators have taken back to Washington from the first responders. Streamline the funding, make it less confusing. Sometimes there's 3 or 4 or even 5 funding streams for one particular program, and those still occur, but they seem to be placing contiguous operations under the same office, which again we've already been doing at the state level by having the state coordinating council of proper disciplines already at the table. So it's glad to see that our thought process from the federal government on down is kind of going hand in hand with what's actually shaking out of all of this. Now, Peter, you had asked me to speak real briefly about the CERT teams.
Yes.
Okay. CERT is one of the core programs under Citizen Corps. It's kind of an oddity. CERT's been around long before Citizen Corps, long before 9/11 and the USA Freedom Corps and all the presidential directives that those were born out of. CERT's been around for a good 12 plus years. More popular on the West Coast. Reason being, California with its mudslides and earthquakes and some of the more severe types of weather than what we're used to, they identified the need to have grassroots, local, community level people trained to the basic level of response, whether it be directing traffic, some very minor search and rescue, first aid, protect in place procedures, some very fundamental survival and response types of things. So it's been around for a long time. It got reconstituted under Citizen Corps a couple of years ago. American Red Cross, especially here in Maine, has always had an interest in CERT. CERT programming comes from them. It also comes from Maine Emergency Management. There's funding from both of those entities for CERT programs. Again, it's very popular. There are, and I'm not going to speak to an exact number of CERT teams here in Maine. I would last estimate probably 6 or 8, I'm guessing, something along that line. There's continual CERT training going on all over the state, and teams are forming on a regular basis. So that's the popular component. CERT is very useful. One of the things that has been interesting from my perspective, I can relate to the response folks. I can relate to the police, fire, and EMS because I've done it over the years, and I know the attitudes that are inherent towards having volunteers engage in what you feel is your venue. So part of my job has been finding the proper venue to communicate to them that it's not a threat. These volunteers, whether they're CERT or through the VIP service or Medical Reserve Corps, they are there to pick up the slack when the system is overloaded so that the EMTs that are trained and licensed and the police officers that are academy certified and on the road and the firefighters who are trained can do their thing. They don't have to worry about answering phones and all these secondary logistical types of things, directing traffic, closing off a road, things of this nature. That's been one of the foremost, I wouldn't even call it an issue, I'd just say it's one of the foremost public relations and marketing things that we've had to do, was communicate this to the to all of the response community that these people aren't, these folks that want to help aren't invading, that they're there to actually help them do their job. And we've had a good response. It's never really been done at that level before, so we've had a very good response with response and cooperation every place that we've gone. Any questions?
Olin, we have lots of questions for you.
Great.
Community health care workers. You heard perhaps this morning or not, we devoted a whole session to looking at outreach. And, you know, as somebody who's a Citizen Corps coordinator, what were your thoughts when you heard that there's this vast, you know, potential emergency response force at the grassroots level, which really isn't formally incorporated yet?
I think that's exactly what we're trying to do is draw upon that, because clearly when something happens or they see a surge capacity, it doesn't even have to be a terrorist incident, but you know, odds are that's what would be the big draw. When these people come forward, it's better to have them pre-organized, pre-familiar. They'll be more familiar with the in-place systems, and the operational people will be more familiar with them, because they're going to come. They will. They're going to show up. They're going to want to help. They're going to need to help, and their help is going to be needed. Clearly, I think that these programs, depending on how you personalize it, is exactly what that's. You know, it answers that question. You give them the training so that they're an asset, and you utilize them.
Besides addressing this issue of the volunteers and the threat they may pose to the public safety community, albeit when I say threat, I mean the perception that, you know, their involvement ought to be peripheral at best. What are the sorts of things? I mean, do you see adequate numbers as far as the willingness of volunteers to come forward at this point?
There's adequate numbers based on what we've been able to do for programming. Remember, our actual state office has only been open for 2 months now. In that time, we've bolstered two county councils and added, well, in effect, soon to be 3 more. I think I'm not concerned that we won't have the response from the people once we are able to get out there and do the marketing of these programs at the county and local level. I'm not concerned that they won't be there. So I would say yes, I've been happy with the responses that we've had so far.
And what about the ODP reorganization that's coming up? The fact that ODP, just as we saw this morning in talking to Dr. Boyd about Project SafeCom, you know, they're going to have the new Office of Interoperability and Compatibility. Well, you know, ODP is going through a merger now. Could you possibly touch on that briefly?
It's, like I said, this is going to be the third hand that feeds us in the last year and a half, actually less than that, from the federal level. I think that it's a positive move on their part. I think that they're actually looking at their operations and how they interact in their own interoperability within the Department of Homeland Security. I think they're being responsive to issues that have been brought up to them at the congressional level, and sometimes very severely on maybe some dysfunctional areas. I think that they're being responsive. So I think that the fact of what they're titling it and how they're, from my impression, how they seem to be framing this this new component and using the contiguous services, put them under one roof, I think it's wonderful. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction.
And you think there's adequate funding for what you need to do?
I think there is. One of the other components is that, especially in discussing with my counterparts at Maine Emergency Management, the fear that this level of funding isn't going to continue is very real, and we know this. So therefore, what we're trying to do is utilize all of the funding modalities that we can get right now. Build the infrastructures, do the assessments, get the capacity built, all the while building some strong sustainability into everything that we do. Because we know that we're going to have to sustain all these systems and programs on less funding down the road. So we're approaching it right from the beginning with that in the forefront of our minds, that we will have to do this on less money down the road. Right now, yes, there's plenty of money. It's just, it becomes more of an issue of using huge amounts of money appropriately, to be honest with you. So right now it's going very well.
Final question for you, Olin, and you've done a very good job. The state of interoperability. After all, this session is focused on interoperability. You've worked, from a public safety standpoint, on the fire side, on the police side. You know what the EMA structures are like at the county level. How would you characterize the state of interoperability in Maine right now?
I think we've identified it as a need to have increased interoperability. I know it does exist to some extent on some levels, but I think what's happened is that's a catchphrase that we really need to expound upon, because it has to occur. We're too rural and too diverse not to have interoperable systems at all levels, redundant systems. It needs to be there. I think we've identified that and definitely need to move forward with it.
Well, Olin, I appreciate your involvement and your participation and all your preparation time for your presentation. You did an excellent job, and we were glad to have you. And we want to thank the University of Maine at Augusta for hosting you over there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.